Hi, in this video I am going to talk about biodiversity monitoring. The monitoring of biodiversity is related to inventorying, but inventorying is a single time event. We are taking a list of organism or the properties of organism, ecological function, we are measuring everything in a particular time and we are recording and keeping a list of everything. But in monitoring, we are actually monitoring the changes and the dynamics in biodiversity over a period of time. The period can be of 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, maybe pretty longer than that. So in monitoring, we are closely monitoring how the biodiversity is changing over time. So the inventorying and biodiversity monitoring related but different. By definition, biodiversity monitoring is the process of determining the status and tracking changes in biodiversity. So we are doing two different things here. First one is the determine the status of biodiversity, how complex it is, how rich it is, what all species are there, what are the structure of the biodiversity, what are the functions of the biodiversity. So we are actually determining the status, current status, and we are actually tracking the changes in biodiversity over time. So how it is, the properties of biodiversity is changing over time. That's what we are tracking, and it is a systematic and focused measurement of biodiversity dynamics over time. So for the measurement of for the monitoring of biodiversity, we are employing systematic and focused studies. Systematic in the sense there should be methods of sampling, there should be methods of acquiring data, there should be statistically sound method of analyzing and making conclusions. So it's a multidisciplinary kind of thing. So we use these statistical and scientific methods to study the biodiversity dynamics over a period of time. And this biodiversity monitoring can be done at different levels. It can be done at the genes level, like the genetic diversity of the organism, or we can it done by taxa level. The taxa in the sense the species diversity, genus diversity, family diversity, order diversity, everything can be studied. And the structure of the biodiversity can be studied. Then the functions of biodiversity, how functional it is, can be studied, or the ecosystem function can be also studied. And in case of any monitoring studies, its consistency and authenticity is depending on the duration of study. If you are having a study for 10 years, which will be better than a study of 5 years. So as the duration of study increases, its consistency and integrity of the data will also increases, and the predictability also increases with the duration of study. So monitoring is generally a very long time study. And what are the aims of monitoring biodiversity? There are different aims for this monitoring. First one is to determining rate and direction of change in biodiversity. As we know, due to the human activities and the global environmental changes, there is a huge rate of extinction and loss of biodiversity globally. So even if we say we have a loss of biodiversity globally, some places there is an increase in biodiversity also. So we want to study this. We want to know what is the rate, at what rate biodiversity is increasing or decreasing. So we want to know the rate and the direction, whether it is positive, whether it is negative. So we want to study all this. So first aim is to study the rate and direction of change in biodiversity. Secondly, to evaluate integrity of an ecosystem, how affected it is, how the man-made activities are affecting the ecosystem, how the global climate changes are affecting. So we want to study that, how integrity of the ecosystem. We want to study the ecosystem responses to disturbance, like the natural calamities, or maybe construction of a dam, or by the global rise in temperature, the greenhouse effect, or the hole in the ozone, how it is affecting the forest. We can study all that. We want to know how it is affecting, how it is responding to the different responses. And it is also used for resource management. Sometimes we need to use the area, the untouched areas of ecosystem for other purposes. So how well we can manage it, how much care should be taken, what are the sensitive areas, what are not that sensitive. So for the resource management, monitoring is good, and it also helps in policy making, especially in the international levels. The international policies, especially by the United Nations, are formulated based on the monitoring of biodiversity, the trends, its rates, and its direction. And it can be also used for to assess the performance of conservation and recovery practices, conservation of ecosystem as well as for the extinct species. We have so many efforts, the international organizations are having so many efforts to conserve the nature. So in order to assess the success or failure of such programs, we need to have a system for monitoring biodiversity. And about the monitoring programs, there are a wide variety of ways we can actually assess the biodiversity, and it is largely inconsistent. Some group of studies will take some type of methods, and other groups will use another type of methods. And most of the times, these methods are not consistent. We cannot actually get a idea, a bird's eye view of the system if different people are using different systems. So there is a need of having a consistent system of assessing and monitoring biodiversity globally. But unfortunately, such systems are absent till date. And this monitoring programs should have the capacity to understanding the properties and dynamics of ecosystem. As we discussed earlier videos, inventorying is very difficult because it's a very complex system, and biodiversity complexity is very high, and the sampling is difficult. So there are so many difficulties for making an inventory. Same thing applies here. We cannot actually study the whole biodiversity in an area, in a huge geographical area. We can actually study maybe an indicator organism or a keystone species, something like that. So, whatever methods we are using a keystone species or an indicator organism. This method should be able to give a good idea about the properties and dynamics of the ecosystem. So, it should be a good representation of the ecosystem dynamics. So, that's a first requirement of monitoring programs. It should be capable of giving a good measurement of properties and dynamics of ecosystem. And every monitoring program should have a good statistical design so that we can extrapolate the data globally, and consistent protocols so that if every nations in the world is using the same consistent protocols, we can actually pool the data to get an idea of the global biodiversity changes. Otherwise, methods may be contradictory. We cannot pool the data in one thing. So consistent protocols all over the world is recommended, and there should be methods to assess the ecological integrity, and the measurement of ecological integrity need to be consistent as well as specific for a specific different regions. Maybe the methods which can be used in the temperate forest cannot be applicable for the other forests, tropical forests. So it should be consistent, still compactable. That's what we need. And another factor of monitoring programs is that spatial coverage based on ecosystem rather than jurisdictions. Most of the times, the monitoring of biodiversity is limited to a state or a country, but the ecosystem is not limited to the jurisdictions of a country. If you look at one of the largest forests in the world, which is Amazon forest, which is spread in different countries. If one country, Brazil, is studying the forest, Amazon forest properties in their jurisdiction, it may be different from the Argentina. So different countries sharing the same ecosystem. So the mountain studies should be based on the ecosystem rather than based on nations. Measurement of trends. We always want to know the trend in biodiversity, whether it is increasing or decreasing or it is diversifying, which taxa is getting benefited. So the mountain program should be able to bring out the trends in biodiversity change, and it is also useful for detecting rapid and unexpected changes. Sometimes those things happens in ecosystem, especially in the light of the global environmental changes. So our monitoring program should be also able to measure the unexpected rapid changes in ecosystem. So in biodiversity monitoring, what we are monitoring is like the dynamics of biodiversity, how it is changing. That's a question. So how it is changing over the time. Last 10 years, how the biodiversity changes, or last 15 years, how it is changes. Based on that data, we can actually predict what is going to happen after 10 years. So that's what we do. So before that, we should understand what is the dynamics of biodiversity. Biodiversity is actually dynamic, naturally dynamic. It's a feature of biodiversity. It will change without any human interference, without any human activities, without the industries, without the global environmental changes. Still, the biodiversity changes naturally. There's a dynamics in that. It will increase, it will decrease, it will be stable, so it will do all sort of things. And this dynamics in terms of composition of biodiversity, what are the components, like what are the species in it, what are the genetic variants in it, structure, how it is structured, how community is structured, how habitat is structured, that will change, and functions. These three things, composition, structure, and function of biodiversity, will change. These are the basic features of a ecosystem. All of them will change. And this change can be due to either external or internal influence. Internal influence is like the natural system, natural predators, maybe natural changes in the habitat, maybe the natural calamities, everything included as the internal influence. And there is also external influence. External influence are mainly due to the human activities, the rise in global temperature, or maybe the increased carbon dioxide level, ozone hole. So things like pollution, so things like that can act as an external influence. So there is a dynamics of biodiversity. The biodiversity changed naturally, and it can also influenced by the human activities. And this thing, the biodiversity dynamics can be due to external influence or internal influence. And it is say the biodiversity and environment are always interact. The changes in biotic and abiotic environmental factors can influence the biodiversity. If there is a change in temperature, which can actually affect the biodiversity. If there is a pollution, that can affect the biodiversity. So any environmental factors, biotic or abiotic, can influence the biodiversity. And in return, the changes in biodiversity can actually influence the environment. Like changes in the forest cover actually control the amount of carbon dioxide in an area. In the atmospheric carbon dioxide level can be controlled by the forest. So environmental factors affects biodiversity, and the biodiversity affects the environment. So it's a interacting system. And what are the drivers of changes in biodiversity? As I told just before, there are internal factors and external factors. Internal factors are due to the natural variations and genetic pool, predators and everything. External factors are basically man-made activities. In recent years, maybe recent decades, the human-made global environmental change has caused a rapid change in biodiversity. We are actually in the verge of an extinction, massive extinction. We discussed it earlier. So, man-made global environmental change is a huge issue in decreasing biodiversity. So, there's a global decline in biodiversity due to the environmental changes, due to the pollution. And another threat to the biodiversity is the genetically modified organisms or part of the genome. We are introducing more and more genetically modified organisms into the environment, and there we are so much concerned about how it is going to affect biodiversity. And so many studies are telling that it may be harmful, and there is some studies telling that it is beneficial for the mankind. So we are still in a state of confusion. We don't know whether what's going to happen if you are releasing more and more genetically modified organisms, whether it is going to positively affect biodiversity or negatively affect biodiversity. And if you look at the loss of biodiversity in a global scenario, especially 8 countries in the world is contributing to the much of the loss of biodiversity, which includes Australia, China, Colombia, Ecuador, Indonesia, Malaysia, Mexico, and the United States. These are the 8 countries which is in their jurisdiction. Most of the biodiversity loss is happening. Fortunately, our country is not in the list. So we need to monitor biodiversity, basically the biodiversity monitoring dynamics. So for the biodiversity monitoring dynamics, we should study indication, measurement, understanding, and protection. It has 4 different components. There should be indicators of the organism, of the biodiversity, and we should measure the indicators in the system, and we should understand the changes in biodiversity, and we should also able to predict the future changes. So that's what the monitoring biodiversity actually about. And by these methods, we can actually use this monitoring system for testing and measurement of vulnerability. What are the weak spots? What are the weak areas of biodiversity? What are the factors are mostly affecting the biodiversity changes or resilience of a ecosystem or restorability? How much biodiversity loss can be compensated by the conservation efforts or other system properties? So the monitoring biodiversity includes many things, and it's a complex scenario, and in always, in almost all cases, we are actually measuring biodiversity based on indicators. We have so many indicators of biodiversity change. We are actually studying the indicators to get an idea about the change in biodiversity. The indicators can be an indicator organism, maybe a lichen, maybe a keystone species, something like that. So the only requirement is that the indicators should have a correlation between with the biodiversity change. If there is an increase in biodiversity, that should be reflected in the as a change in indicators. Most of the time, we can use the organisms as an indicator, particular species as an indicator, maybe other factors like the climate change or the soil quality, ecosystem function, which can also use it as a indicator. The indicator can be a qualitative or quantitative function. The qualitative thing is like just measuring the presence or absence of an indicator species. But mostly we are using quantitative methods. We want to know how much it is going to happen. Just presence or absence, we want more. So in quantitative indicators, what we measure the abundance or population density of species, which is directly correlated to the biodiversity or distribution area of a habitat or number of a typical species in a habitat. So these whole things can be used as a quantitative measure of biodiversity. So what are the, I'm going to finish this video by stating the basic goals of monitoring. First goal is to measurement of direction and the rate of present change. How biodiversity is changing and which direction it is changing, and how the natural resources or threats are changing over the time. So first goal is to measurement of direction and rate of change in biodiversity. Secondly, understand the role and impact of drivers and cause of change. Why this change happens. Second aim goal is to why this is happening. It is because of an internal factor or an external factor. To thirdly, analyze the process and the mechanism of change. We know the biodiversity is changing. We know why it is changing. We want to know how it is changing. Okay, why this external or internal factor is changing the biodiversity in this manner. And finally, we want to predict the future changes. So the four aims including firstly the measurement of the rate and direction of biodiversity change. Second, we want to know the cause of change, why this change is happening. And thirdly, we want to know how it is happening, what is the mechanism, what is the process of change in biodiversity. Finally, we want to predict what is going to go happen next. And this prediction also including what we can do to prevent the loss of biodiversity. So that's are the basic goals of monitoring biodiversity. Thank you for watching.